Nietzsche believed that the role of a philosopher was to be a physician of culture. In some sense, a philosopher can distinguish and remember what is healthy and flourishing versus what is sick. He can distinguish the two and therefore become a doctor for his people in a sense. And its interesting thing is that philosophy flourishes when culture declines. Like when the aristocracy of Greece, of ancient Athens, was in decay, democracy, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all were born from that. Because there was this great decay, there was this great demise happening with the inside their democracy. So all of a sudden, philosophy had a need. There was a need for it. The same thing is happening today. The same thing happened in Nietzsche's times. Like today, there's craziness happening in the dating market, in marriage rates declining, in the epidemic of obesity, of pills, of depression, of anxiety. Everyone's just isolated in apartments, not really talking to one another. And like, there's just so many problems. We need to get into them, but all of them are spiking. Culture is literally collapsing around us. And it's why there's so many philosophers rising on the internet in a sense. If you go look at the top podcasts on, Spotify, a lot of them are philosophy oriented. I want to read you a quote from Nietzsche before we get into some of these Instagram posts that I want to review today. So, quote, "Philosophy is a seeking after everything strange and questionable in existence, all that has hitherto been excommunicated by morality. Ecce homo." So, philosophy, in a sense, is a questioning art. And it's especially in the questioning of taboos of your time, right? And this is what the philosopher does, and why the historical sense might be kind of important, is morality changes. And what happens when morality changes is it excommunicates large aspects of life that are now totally taboo, okay? And a couple of those in today's day would be race, would be group identity, would be war, peace, democracy, the value of democracy, the value of God, diversity. A lot of these things are now taboo. It's just like imposed on you. Anyways, my friends, the philosopher art is to question the fucking sacred cows. Question the holy cows. That's where the meat is. And oftentimes we need to go back to periods like the Renaissance, like ancient Greece, where there was flourishing and healthy culture to remember how they saw the world. So we can learn to look at our world through their eyes. That's what philosophy does, and why a philosopher is a physician of culture. I saw this on Instagram, and it actually sparked this video. It says, "Human life is sacred. Human dignity is sacred. Human cultures are sacred. The human right to be free from violence is sacred." Now, this and about a million other of these quotes are posted every single day of these freedom fighters for Palestine. And guys, I'm just going to say what I think here and before I qualify it with Palestine and all these things. But ultimately, there's this line that says the human right to be free of violence is sacred. This is a moral structure of our time. This is a right or wrong valuation. That's what morality is. It's a valuation thing. It's like, this post values, obviously, total peace, right? But it has no historical sense whatsoever. It's written by someone totally ignorant, like absolutely ignorant. The human right to be free of violence is not sacred. In fact, in almost every culture, time, and tradition, violence, war was sacred. And in every flourishing culture, war was perhaps the most sacred thing. We look at things like ancient Greece, the samurai flourishing in Japan. We look at, Viking in Native Americans. War was a central part of every culture for all of time. Violence, the lack of violence was never sacred. In fact, the balance between peace and war is what was sacred. And war was really important for the development of masculinity in fighting men. And so we have this valuation today that all conflict is bad. And the philosopher, what a philosopher does in a sense, is he takes a moral valuation that is universal in his time and questions it. This post, "The human right to be free from violence is sacred," is one of the most false statements I've literally ever heard. This person has never obviously been in nature for any period of time. Because if you do go into nature, you're going to see the hawk literally gutting the rabbit while it's alive, the lion eating the gazelle while it still lives, the wolves literally starving to death in winter. Like, there is violence everywhere. Nature is one of the most violent places on earth. If you go to the Amazon rainforest or any jungle, it is just a cacophony of death and violence. The entire thing, everything is eating everything else. And the crazy thing is that's also human nature. And to say that the lack of violence is sacred is to literally shun human nature. This is what my next video is about. It's about the shadow and how the shadow is created. And the shadow within people is created when we shun our biological instincts, our passions, our natural selves. We create a shadow. Oh, your instinct towards violence, ambition, competition, grandiosity, all of that is bad, right? Then it retreats to the shadow. The interesting thing, in different cultures, those things would have been seen as great, like glorious, malevolent violence in war. To an ancient Greek aristocrat, would have been seen as divine. So to these Instagram moralists, my question would be is what's the right amount of violence? What's the right amount of conflict? When can war be good? And the thing is most of these people will lie to themselves and they'll say 0. Like, so many people have a utopian idea of reality that we can get to a point where there is no more conflict. And it's really interesting is like, I'm an idealist. I believe in a golden age and I'm here to create a golden age. But I think violence might actually be really important in that. It's almost like Heraclitus is saying that war is the father of all things. I want to give you an example of why violence might be important. Is when you have extended periods of peace in any culture or civilization, decadence rules. In ancient times, periods of peace were looked upon with great mistrust because lying, like addictions, degeneration was inevitable. It was only when you and your brothers were about to go to war that discipline and virtue prevailed. Like, if you had ongoing conflict with your neighboring tribe, every man in your crew would be the most virtuous possible. Why? Because you would demand it of them. If you knew that you're going to be standing on the bridge fighting to the death for your whole family, right? You would want the person next to you to be in their A game all the time. And this is why war creates virtue. Is when there's conflict, when there's struggle, you have to be your best. You have to do your best. When there's no struggle, when there's all peace, everything is dissolution. Everything degenerates. And we even see this with like sports. Like, if you have to train and compete and prepare for the championship, you become your best version. And this is why there's this idea that flourishing cultures, flourishing nations, the success of a new nation can be determined by one factor. How much responsibility does each individual have on their shoulders? The higher the responsibility, the greater the us versus them, or the greater the external conflict, the more successful that nation will be. And this is why nations rise to power on frontiers, right? What's a good example of that? Essentially, when there's a frontier, when there's open space to conquer and there's danger beyond the borders, it creates the most group cohesion, group collaboration, and the idea of wasabia. And wasabia is shared group feeling, a shared vision and feeling towards something. And you have that when there's great conflict. I know for me, going almost to the state championship in football in high school, the feeling of wasabia, of group shared feeling and determination on that team was fucking beautiful. I've tried to recreate it my whole life in some way. And there is no sense of brotherhood anymore. There's no sense of community anymore because we have no shared purpose. This is so important. People who hate conflict will never live in community. Even though they say they want community over and over and over and over, the thing that creates community is conflict. And I'm going to give you about 100 examples here because this lights me up. this is the idea of nationalism, okay? Imagine if you grew up in Boston, okay? And from your high school, the best baseball player like moved up. He went to Boston College, played baseball there. He went and then he started playing for the Boston Red Sox. In fact, the Boston Red Sox, the professional baseball team, had all the best baseball players that grew up there. Okay, they went to college there, they went to high school there, they're known in the community. The whole community is only 1 degree away from them. You either know one of the players directly or your friends know them directly. Imagine the group feeling of camaraderie, of wasabia when the Red Sox played, the New York Yankees. The group feeling would be incredible because there's nationalism. Your Boston state, your Boston city is united against the Yankees, okay? What happens these days is the Boston Red Sox are filled with people from LA, from Puerto Rico, from the New York Yankees, from Minnesota. Like, it's just, there's no nationalism about it, right? And because of this, the idea of a culture behind the Boston Red Sox is quickly fading. In fact, all culture around the world is quickly fading right now because of globalism, because of this mixing, this multiculturalism. There's no group identity. There's no group feeling and shared purpose outside of these large social institutions like wokeism or something like that. There are a few left, but what I'm saying is when you have high group identity and then conflict with another group like Red Sox versus Yankees, all of a sudden it creates this amazing electric culture of community, camaraderie, shared feeling between the Yankees and the Red Sox. And this is what people want. This is actually what we all crave. I don't know any of my neighbors in this huge apartment I just moved into. I probably never really will. Maybe I'll meet a few of them. We'll be acquaintances. Maybe I'll meet a friend. But we're not going to conquer anything together. There's no war where I need all of them to be their best selves and we need to create group flow. There's no business we need to build. There's not even a sense of nationalism because most of the people in this apartment building probably hate their own country, right? There's this really weird disease in culture right now. And it's a disease of dispersion of all shared feeling, all shared values. And I think personally that this is a disease that comes when we lack conflict, which is crazy. Like we almost need war. We need conflict and we need it at smaller scales. The problem is in the 1900s, the conflicts became global for the first time ever. We had World War I, World War II, right? And there was a lot of nationalism at that time. For good or for worse. We could go into the moralization of it later. But I think the conflicts became too big and then we got too scared of conflict in general. And there's this really interesting question that I think of all the time is like, where is the dangerous frontier where me and a small group or a small community, let's say like 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people could go have conflict again? You see, the native tribes across America, for instance, would have like these like staged wars in a sense, where not many young men died, but they still had to go practice courage against the threat of death. Like that idea was the initiation into manhood. This was so prominent across all the world. And also that experience of war created awesome group feeling and group identity within a tribe. So it just brings me to this question. Is the lack of violence sacred? Absolutely not. The lack of violence will lead to the destruction of everything. War is the father of all things. War is what creates virtue. War is what creates group flow and group feeling and shared sense of identity. Like, it's so important. And when I say war, I'm literally speaking of trials, of hard times, of hardships, conflict, and yes, war and violence. Like all of them are important. And the problem is when you say it's totally bad, you create shadow, right? And we just do this all the time, everywhere. Is all these like institutions and ideas and things that we implement culturally aren't philosophically based, because there's been a death of philosophy in some sense, and this great self-denial, this great ignorance, this great lying to ourselves. And I think this needs to be addressed. So I'm talking.